this one. Well, that answers the question of whether the mic is on. It's on. I would like the accessory to connect. No. So I want to not use screen mirroring. There we go. Almost. Cursor. Where's the cursor? Well, I might just go with it. Okay, we're going to live with the surrounding Chrome of Chrome, actually. Okay, so good morning, everybody. Welcome to Flutter Friends. Now, Lucas kind of spoiled my first sentence. I was going to say, some of you may know me, but he assured you all that you all know me, so hopefully no one's feeling bad if they don't. But yeah, my name is Craig Labenz, and I have the great pleasure of working at Google on the Flutter Developer Relations team, which amongst other things brings me all over the world to conferences like this. And I've given a fair amount of technical talks in my day. So despite having stood on stages like this and having talked to folks like you, when Lucas asked me if I'd stand on this stage and give this talk, I was actually pretty hesitant. I wasn't sure if I'd have anything worthy of a keynote stage to say. So let me make this a little bigger actually real quick. Oh, just literally nothing's happened with that? All right, let me try again. Are you sure it's not in slide mode? I think it is. Yeah, I put it on slide mode. Yeah, see there, slide number 2. I will try again. You, do the thing. And then you, come here. Okay. I don't know why it's not going full screen. Maybe this old button right there. Oh, we're so close. Nope, function F didn't do it. Enter full screen.
I guess we'll see the slides like that.
Yeah, it refuses to cooperate. As my dad says, technology, it'll never catch on. All right, now we need the cursor back here. Oh lordy, no, wrong way. What is the monitor arrangement? I don't know. No way that I move the cursor will it escape this space and go back. No, is it up? Lordy, it's none of them. System settings, we're going to go old school here. Look at the monitor arrangement. No, I can't get to the monitor arrangement window. Oh my gosh. Now maybe I can escape confinement? No.
You have to exit full screen.
Oh, I'm in full screen mode. See, this is the worst Mac OS feature in the world. It is terrible. No, I still can't get out. Oh, here, okay, I've got it. Okay, so it's this, no. Well, this didn't happen in any of my rehearsals. Let me tell you. Displays. Wow, this is great. Maybe I'll do a Mac OS update while we're at it. Arrange. Oh, this is the arrangement? That's crazy. No wonder. Okay, here we go. I have a theory that if I do this and go back here, and that's pseudo full screen, partial screen, some might say. Okay, where the heck was I? What was the last thing I said? Yeah, I wasn't sure if I'd have anything worthy of a keynote stage to say. So my first talk idea was going to be something like the future of widgets, which I was pretty excited about. But my whole team swatted down that idea and encouraged me to think bigger. Now, obviously, I did eventually confirm with Lucas that I would come here and give this talk, because here I am. And that was only after I accepted the fact that anything I talked about would obviously have already been covered by someone else in a way better way in some other keynote, but at least I would talk about it in my own words, and that would be somewhat original. So I set out on my grand adventure to find the one topic to rule them all, and in the darkness bind them. And I was researching and brainstorming with teammates and watching other keynotes and whatnot. I knew the right topic was out there, I just had to find it. And you've already seen this slide. So as I was researching, I was watching the 2019 PyCon US keynote, see if I would get any inspiration from it. And lo and behold, I did. The speaker was a man named Russell Keith McGee. He's an old teammate of mine when I was at Zapier. He's a Django core contributor. And interestingly enough, he's actually the primary maintainer of a library called Beware, which you can basically think of as Python's version of Flutter, even though Beware is actually way older than Flutter. Anyway, Russell's talk was great, and he made this one comment while he was setting up the age of Python. And he said this 5 years ago, so you can increment the numbers in your head, as they say, never do math on stage. And he said, Python is 28 years old, but it took 10 years to gain any decent recognition in our industry, and then another 10 years before we had all of this, which he said with this grand gesture out toward the 1,000+ person audience in front of him. And I thought, oh my gosh, Dart itself is only 11 or 12 years old, and Flutter's 1.0 release wasn't even 6 years ago yet. So it feels like we've been doing this for a long time, and we wish our community was even bigger than it is, but measured against the arc of successful technologies, we're actually all still early adopters. And if we are all still early adopters, then everything is still in front of us. Now, just because stuff is in front of us does not mean it will actually come to pass. When Python was only 10 years old, its next 20 years of success was not at all guaranteed. Python had to do a lot of things right to become the ubiquitous language that we know it as today. And I think a lot of what Python had to do, or Python, as Australians say, which I'm a little jealous of, it's a very cool pronunciation. I think a lot of what they had to do correctly revolved around their culture. So that means for us, the culture and the shape of what it means to participate in Flutter is in our hands. We control what that means. And I do mean our hands, the people in this room, the people in the rooms with you at future Flutter events that you may attend. And so then I realized that I had my topic, I knew what I wanted to talk about, how kindness and empathy within the Flutter community will shape our future success or a lack thereof. Now, the reason that I was watching Russell Keith McGee's talk, 2019 PyCon US, like maybe seems a little bit random, is because before Flutter, Python was my community. And if you don't know much about Python's community, that's fine. No community is perfect, but Python's really bends over backwards to make sure that everybody feels a sense of belonging, whether it's technically while they're at home coding or socially on the road at events. And so while I was falling in love with Flutter in the winter of 2018, and I was starting to say these really dramatic sentences like, I think I want my next day job to be about Flutter, I also knew that I didn't really want to leave the Python community, or at least I didn't want to leave those attributes of kindness and empathy. But obviously, something made me take the plunge, because here I am. And I still remember the day and the moment that I emotionally committed myself to Flutter. Fast forward, it was now the summer of 2019, and I was working on my side project basically every day. And I had Andrew Brogdon's I/O talk on adaptive navigation up on my side monitor. And it was about handling different navigational patterns between iOS and Android within one app. And as a longtime fruit company device user, the thought of Google acknowledging iPhones and iOS and those users and their experiences and the value of Google engineers accommodating those experiences absolutely blew my mind. And a few weeks later, I applied to Google to work on Flutter. Now, had my first formative experience with the Flutter community instead been some kind of snarky post or someone dunking on someone else, I might not have ever gone as deep into Flutter as I did. I might not have ever applied to Google. I might not have ever moved to California. I might not have met anyone in this room. Like, my whole life could be different. And as any GDE that I've interviewed will tell you, I end every conversation with a reminder that all of your online interactions could be someone's first encounter with the Flutter community. And this doesn't mean that we can't have disagreements and report frustration and whatnot, like please do report things that frustrate you. As a Flutter team, we know that we need to fix those things. But there's always more and less constructive ways to have any of those conversations. And so as I look at our still youthful community, my charge to all of us is to continue to build the most kind and empathetic corner anywhere in technology. But I mean this in more ways than you might think. So the first way, I think, starts from the Flutter team itself, where we've got to set the tone, and we try our best, imperfectly, I'm sure, to always lead with developer empathy. And really, the Flutter project itself is entirely rooted in empathy. Like if you think about the fact that it's just free and open, that means any developer, anywhere in the world, with nearly any laptop that turns on, can start building their dream project and get it in the hands of users on nearly any device. And Flutter has long known that we could never just kind of go hide away in a cave and come back down from the mountain with a perfectly designed UI toolkit engraved in stone tablets. Like, no, we need to hear reports from you all from the field of what it's like to learn Flutter, what it's like to build apps with Flutter, and what it's like to compete for contracts with Flutter. And so that's why we're doing our best to always listen to what you all have to say, and then we adjust what we're doing, our roadmap, in response. Now, to say nothing of all the excellent documentation that the actual engineers building Flutter write alongside their code, Google also pours a lot of resources into explaining Flutter, both written and video. So to help folks learn Flutter, Google employs some of the best marketers, some of the best technical writers, some of the best developer advocates, and also one of the world's biggest clowns. Now, those things are all fine, but this next one is actually really important to me. And it's best summed up by this old phrase that representation matters. Now, this is one of the greatest American athletes of all time. Obviously, her name is Serena Williams. And she is the winningest player at both the Australian and US Open. Her 367 singles matches victories is most all time. And her 10 majors victories, just counting after the age of 30, which is like when all of my joints stopped working, is most all time. And also, you all know that if you pair her with her sister Venus, the two are one of the most dominant doubles teams of all time. But to me, one of the coolest things that Serena Williams ever did in her career was to inspire an entire generation of black girls to play tennis. And my wife was one such girl. And to this day, tennis is her favorite sport and probably her favorite hobby. And she will be the first to tell you that if she had not grown up watching Serena Williams, she might never have realized that tennis could be for her. And representation matters just as much in tech, a space unevenly distributed across race and gender. And as any advocates for underrepresented groups will tell you, members in those groups are all too often offered mentorship, but not sponsorship. And that's because it's so much easier to just give someone some passing advice than it is to have skin in the game for their success. So on the Flutter team, we try hard to invite community leaders to help us present episodes of our flagship YouTube series. That's because we not only want to sponsor those individuals, but we also want the rest of the world to be able to look at Flutter and see themselves. So this is just a sampling of some of the ways that the Flutter team tries to kind of start the conversation with empathy, imperfectly as we do it, I'm sure. But those efforts would be a candle in the wind without buy-in from the broader community of you all. So I propose that as individuals, for all of us, there's two main ways that we can continue to uphold kindness and empathy as first principles for Flutter. And the first is from developer to developer. So to start, if you are already advanced in your career, great, pay it forward. A great example of this is, of course, Hump Day Q&A, who I'm sure all of us know, the weekly live stream from Simon Lightfoot, Scott Stoll, Randall Monroe, Danielle Cox, John Weesey. And every time I've done this, I say those names in a different order. But that is just a great weekly effort from all of them, an incredible investment of their time. There's also a lot of community-run Discords and Slacks that you can join, and you can even answer questions in those. And if you do answer a question, make sure that the person who asked it really feels just how happy we are to have them. Developer-to-developer empathy also matters in how we file issues, not just on the main Flutter repository, but on all the repositories behind our favorite packages. And again, this is not to say that we can't have opinions and disagreements and even API designs that we dislike, but I would call on all of us to maintain some humility in our own ideas and remember that in any given conversation, it actually could be us that is wrong. Now, at the risk of getting a little philosophical, the great astrophysicist and philosopher David Deutsch, who's my personal intellectual hero, said the following: "Mistakes are the normal condition of humans. All we can do is try to find them. Maybe not destroying the means of correcting errors is the heart of morality, because if there is no way of correcting errors, then sooner or later, one of those will get us." Now, he's talking about how to design societies and the survival of the human race and big fancy stuff like that. But I think the same principles apply to us. I agree that error correction is the most important subsystem in any knowledge generating system, because it is inevitable that some of the knowledge we generate will be wrong. And the only way we can sort out which of the knowledge we generated was wrong is if we remain open to the idea that any given piece of it could be wrong. And in the tech industry, I think we risk more than just personal stasis if we are locked in our own errors. I think we risk tribalism. And thinking about that reminded me of another quote, this time from someone that you've probably heard of before. So Yoda from Star Wars said, "Fear is the path to the dark side. Fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate, and hate leads to suffering." Now that may seem like it has absolutely nothing to do with what I'm talking about, but I think that us developers have our own form of this sequence too. The only difference is ours does not start with fear. I think ours is basically the opposite. It starts with hubris, or not entertaining the possibility that it could be us that is wrong. So for us, I think it goes, hubris is the path to the dark side. Hubris leads to arrogance, arrogance leads to toxicity, and toxicity leads to defensiveness. And defensiveness and tribalism, that's our dark side. That's when we as individuals start to tie our identities to our teams. And this is why I think there's so many holy wars in tech. Software engineers tend to be fairly smart people, but sometimes I think we get a little too excited about ourselves and we forget that each and every one of our opinions, no matter how dearly we hold it, could actually be wrong. And then in our arrogance, we dunk on each other online, which builds resentment between individuals and communities and entrenches everyone's opinion about everything. And this is a well-known phenomenon in psychology. It's called belief perseverance, or the backfire effect. And it's when someone's belief and confidence in their own ideas actually increases even after encountering clear and compelling evidence to the contrary. And what's super interesting about this is between strong arguments, medium arguments, and weak arguments, strong arguments tend to perform poorly because they trigger this backfire effect. Weak arguments perform poorly because, well, they're weak arguments, so they can't convince anyone of anything. And it's those medium strength arguments that actually enjoy the most success convincing people of new ideas. And so this is why I think the antidote to all of this is humility in our own ideas. Because try to imagine like firing off your saltiest take online while also holding on to the idea that it could actually be you that is wrong. I don't think any of us could actually do that. Now, thankfully, this is not a plea into a storm of despair. I think the Flutter community is already exemplary on these fronts. But this is just the kind of developer-to-developer empathy that I want to uphold as Flutter's ideal. Now, the final aspect of empathy that I want to talk about is from all of us developers to our users. Flutter's singular founding principle and kind of core value proposition is around reaching users where they are on whatever devices they use. But what if we change that to something like reaching users however they exist in the world? So obviously here I'm talking about accessibility, but accessibility itself is not actually everything. There's another concept in product design called inclusive design, which is a superset of mere accessibility. And if inclusive design is a new term for you, that's fine. Interactivedesign.org defines it like so. Inclusive design is an approach to create accessible products and experiences that are usable and understandable by as many people as possible. It goes beyond accessibility to consider users' diverse needs, backgrounds, and experiences. So I think if we don't consider inclusive design principles in our products, then we risk unknowingly being a developer who says, I use Flutter to reach as many people as possible all over the world, but is unaware of the invisible and silent ending to that sentence, which says, as long as they're perfectly able-bodied and look exactly like my engineering team. Like, yikes. So a common counterpoint of accessibility and inclusive first engineering is that for any resource-strapped startup, just getting an MVP out the door as fast as possible is all that matters. But, and it's true that we don't want to let perfection be the enemy of the good. But I want to convince all of us that effort spent in this direction doesn't just help a subset of users, it helps all users. So the really fun thing about inclusive design is that following its principles is the act of identifying friction that you may think only a subset of your users are experiencing, but in removing that experience or that friction just for them, you tend to broadly improve your product and end up removing friction for everyone. And some refer to this phenomena as like universal design, which is that act of thinking you're helping just a subset of users and like, whoa, accidentally helped everyone. Other people think universal design is kind of its own principle or its own framework and approach for product design. Like, I'm not a scholar on all this stuff. I probably don't have the terms totally correct. But for the rest of this talk, I'm just going to refer to all of this as inclusive design, which is the conscious effort to include all of your users. So, and I do want to return to this idea of not letting perfect be the enemy of the good, as the English idiom goes. Perfect inclusive engineering is probably not possible, and chasing it can prevent you from ever releasing your app. But there are some easy kind of ideas that I think all developers should keep in mind for the entire lifecycle of their project, from idea inception to development, testing, and releasing. So we're going to take a look at 8 different principles of inclusive design, including real-world examples, and some of them really ended up kind of escaping their original scope and helping everyone. And then we'll also look at how we can apply each of these to our apps. So the first principle of inclusive design is called equitable use, which is defined as providing the same means of use for all users, which encourages inclusion and lessens stigma. And a great example of this in real life are these little ramps and sidewalks called curb cuts. And they were originally only designed for folks with wheelchairs in mind. But guess who else uses them? Everyone. Parents pushing strollers, travelers dragging luggage, cyclists hauling their bikes. And what's beautiful about this design is that it allows everyone to engage with the sidewalk in the same way by seamlessly crossing the boundary, instead of segmenting how folks in wheelchairs are supposed to interact with the sidewalk. So how do we ensure equitable use in our apps? Well, the first thing, super obvious, localization. Few things are more powerful than letting your users interact with your software in their native language. Adjustable font sizes, also very important. They allow anyone with degraded vision to just still read everything clearly. And in Flutter, to make use of the operating system's default, all we have to do is not override the text scaler on the media query. But you probably have to actually change the font size in your phone and then run your app again to make sure your UI doesn't totally fall apart. The second principle of inclusive design is flexibility in use, which is defined as accommodating all by offering choices for users. And to me, a quintessential example of user choice is audiobooks. If you can't read a book, then you can listen to it if you'd like. And this was originally only designed for visually impaired folks. But again, guess who ends up using audiobooks? Everybody who's busy, either driving to work or folding laundry or washing the dishes, and also wanting to read a book. And the key takeaway here and the insight is that whether because your vision degrades or just because you're busy, all of us will have visited upon us at some time in our lives the experience of wanting to read a book but not being able to point our eyes at it. So removing friction for those people ends up removing friction for everybody. Another great example of this is closed captions. This is basically the exact opposite of audiobooks. If you can't hear a video, then you can read it. And to say nothing of, some people leave these on all the time because you can't hear any dialogue in TV and movies these days. Beyond that, anyone who's just listening to a video in a loud public space, or maybe listening to a video quietly in bed next to their sleeping partner. And just think, without closed captions, we wouldn't know how Spock was sobbing here. Like, is he sobbing existentially? Is he sobbing like ironically? Think of the confusion. So how do we do this in our apps? Well, pretty obvious, but just light mode, dark mode. Some people prefer one, some people prefer the other. Flutter offers light themes and dark themes. We just have to define them. Another great choice for user flexibility is to integrate with voice command systems like Google Assistant. This can allow a distracted or occupied user to still complete an action in your app. And you might not even make them open your app in the first place. They might be able to complete an action while just kind of walking by a smart home device on their way to the kitchen. I also think a low-key, pretty sneaky avenue for user choice is keyboard shortcuts. And to explain this, I always think about my own kind of mobile form factor bias and remember that some users, especially maybe older users, may prefer larger versions of the UI or even like printed versions of the UI. Well, I'm not saying we have to make printable versions of our apps. But 10 years ago, I was DMing a game of Dungeons and Dragons for my family, and I made this primitive digital character tracker. And I showed my cousins and uncles who were in the game this thing, and I was really surprised to hear one of my uncles ask why he couldn't print off his character sheet. And the simple answer was because I didn't want to look up the browser APIs, and so I didn't code it into the system. But the better answer was that because to me, the whole point of this little character tracker was to not have a character sheet. But for him, even though the screen maybe looked shiny and was ostensibly cool, it was less accessible and less tangible to him. He wanted to be able to take notes on the piece of paper. And so if you imagine, I often imagine users only engaging with an app that I'm building on their phone. But that doesn't mean someone's not going to download it on their tablet and want to attach a Bluetooth keyboard and mouse. And for that, of course, keyboard shortcuts really completes the experience. So the third principle of inclusive design is called simple and intuitive use, which avoids complexity while ensuring all users can understand how to use or operate. Now, this one seems pretty obvious, like, no duh, have a simple app. Great, Craig. But arguably, here, the stakes may be highest of all. Now, for those of you who don't know, this is a picture of the control room in 3 Mile Island, a nuclear power plant in the United States that suffered a near catastrophic accident in 1979. Thankfully, the overall engineering quality of this plant prevented it from totally melting down and exploding like the Chernobyl plant did 7 years later in 1986. But root cause analysis of the 3 Mile Island incident still revealed tremendous problems. Now, the investigation was led by a man named Don Norman, and he's the person who coined the term user experience. And he wrote in his report, thanks to the catastrophically bad control room design, and you just love the shade here, like the shade is so thick you could freeze to death in it, the operators were unable to understand what was going wrong. They continued making bad choices as the plant and the men who operated it were not in sync. The plant was not designed for bad decisions that men can take, and men couldn't understand what the plant was doing in a crisis. Obviously, this paragraph was written before the really revolutionary idea of women having careers had arrived. But look at these panels. Don Norman found that there were, and I quote, 0 organizing principles for how controls were designed or grouped. In one specific panel, he found 14 different meanings for the color red and 9 different meanings for the color green. So obviously the staff at this plant had no chance. Now ultimately, it did not melt down and destroy the entire state of Pennsylvania, which contains it. So you might think this is like a no blood, no foul situation. But to this day, America is still afraid of nuclear power. Think about how far ahead the whole world could be on climate change if that panel had just made sense. It's crazy to think about. So now that I've made keep your app simple seem like a matter of life and death, what do we do? Well, first, include user experience experts in your process as soon as you can. Obviously, all projects have a limited budget and can't do everything, but in my experience, time spent with UX experts up front easily pays for itself by avoiding wasted and duplicated work. But for some more concrete quick wins, a great practice for clear and intuitive UIs is to just have a clear and consistent information hierarchy. Anytime you establish an expectation somewhere in your app, treat that as sacred everywhere in your app. Similarly, consistent icons and controls allow a person to very quickly and easily parse what's going on the screen, greatly reducing friction of using your app. Now, the fourth principle is called perceptible information, which allows all users to access information regardless of ability, experience, or literacy, which maybe on the surface feels like kind of a tall order, but in the real world, I think pictograms are a great example of this. Don't speak English? That's fine. This sign still perfectly communicates its message. Now, humorously enough, not all signs are created equally. This sign, which comes from OSHA, the United States governmental body for worker safety, means like beware of the fish. Maybe don't drink the water, like did that kill the fish? The tree has no leaves, is that involved? Presumably there's some kind of ecological disaster here, right? But I don't know whether it's already happened or I'm about to cause it. So anytime you lean on pictures or iconography to convey information, just make sure that it actually does convey information. And as for this sign, I never did figure it out. It's probably explained in an OSHA manual somewhere, but it does not convey information to me. In our apps, perceptible information, first and foremost, has to be legible to human eyeballs. So that means, first, sufficient contrast. And you know this when you see it. I haven't decided yet if that pun was intended or not, but interestingly, orange on orange can have great contrast if one is light and one is dark. Meanwhile, orange and green, two very different colors, can have terrible contrast if they're both dark. Human eyes are funny things. Another huge one here is just legible fonts. Can you read what this says? Like maybe if your English is really, really good, but handwriting fonts can present a significant challenge to anyone using your app in not their native language. And this is especially true because even though we celebrate localization, we're obviously not going to be able to localize our app to every language in the world. And for me, as someone who's newly learning Korean and is still completely terrible at it, I'm horrified at the thought of encountering some cutesy, very demure handwriting font in Korean that makes all the Hangul look different, and like now I have even less of an idea what's going on. So the fifth concept, or the fifth principle of inclusive design, is tolerance for error, which minimizes hazards and the consequences of mistakes. So for a real world example here, I think of just any slow moving automation that gives users a time to react, or self-correcting systems like safety shutoffs. And in apps, my mind always just goes to reversible decisions. So any kind of recently deleted section, also persisting form progress in local storage. This can prevent an accidental backwards navigation from jettisoning everything that someone has typed into all the different form inputs from memory. We all know that losing work is literally the worst thing that can ever happen to you. Relatedly, not all actions can actually be reversed. If you have a hard delete in your database, then you cannot easily restore that record. So if someone is about to take a destructive and irreversible action, just a confirmation dialog so they know exactly what they're getting into. The sixth principle of inclusive design is low physical effort, which is pretty self-explanatory. I would also give this one high marks for not requiring a lot of physical effort to understand, very internally consistent. And in the real world, I love this example, electric toothbrushes. These were only designed for folks with limited dexterity in mind, but it turns out no amount of human dexterity can compete with an electric toothbrush, so everyone uses these, including myself, because I definitely want whiter teeth. Within apps, I think a great example is animating state changes. This reduces the amount of focus and attention that users have to pay every single 16 milliseconds to see what actually changed. Another great example is easy password reset flows, social login, potentially email auth links, or even just pass keys to help users never have to think about a password in the first place. Now, the next principle is around the size and physical space that's taken up by a product. And this is defined as providing easily navigable space that users can reach and manipulate. Classic example, I think, in the real world, sit-to-stand desks. How tall are you? Great, this desk accommodates that height. Do you like to stand part of the day? Great, this desk accommodates whatever you just said. So obviously, these are great. A nice digital example of this is iOS's trick of double tapping on part of the screen and having the whole UI shift down so it's now all accessible to your thumb. And this really helps anyone using your phone or using their phone with just one hand. And again, you already know how the pattern goes. This could be because they always only have one hand available, or their second hand might just be busy holding their child or a bag of groceries. So at one point or another, all of us will only have one hand available. Now the last principle, this one is my own. The previous 7 I found on a list somewhere, but then I tacked this one on. And I call this one global thinking, and my very profound definition for it is avoiding assumptions and biases with an eye toward product decisions that may alienate users. And for decades, one of summertime's most common activities, putting on sunblock, worked better for people with lighter colored skin. And this isn't because sunblock didn't physically work and block UV radiation on dark skin, it just left a chalky residue while it did so. And across the beauty industry, from sunscreen to clothes and makeup, just awareness of the genetic diversity of customers ends up elevating the experience for everyone. Now, within our apps, I think allowing folks to express themselves more directly and authentically is a great step here. And it allows everyone to feel like an app really wanted them specifically. So this is called the Fitzpatrick scale, and it replaced the old emoji set of just those yellow tone emojis that I always imagined were inspired by the American cartoon The Simpsons, but I don't actually know. But everyone knew that that yellow skin actually meant white people. So now everyone can feel like they are expressing themselves in apps. So these are the 8 pillars of universal design: equitable use, flexible use, simple and intuitive UIs, perceptible information, tolerance for errors, low physical effort requirements, flexible use of physical space, and global thinking. And I think that keeping these in mind from the beginning can help us design products that truly delight all of our users. Now, of course, there's great guidance on this online. You're not alone to figure it out yourself. This is some of Google's accessible design documentation, and obviously Apple has a lot in its own human interface guidelines as well. And you don't have to write down these links. These are some of the most easily discovered pages on the internet. Now, all of these tips are good and fun, but how is a team supposed to identify where these sneaky sources of friction are coming from? We've talked about a lot of different vectors in which people can be outside the kind of heat map of your engineering team. But just to focus on assistive technologies for a second, in my experience, the best way to do this is you've got to test your apps with people who use assistive technologies. So if you don't depend on a screen reader yourself in real life, for example, as I don't, then it's just very hard to imagine where friction is going to come from for somebody. You can't close your eyes and think really hard and just divine where it'll be. And then you might think, well, I'll turn on the screen reader and close my eyes and try to drive my app that way. But if you've never used a screen reader before, then that task is just going to feel impossible. And like the problem is intractable and nothing that you do will actually help anything. But the human brain is amazing and can get good at anything. And people are really good at driving their phones through alternate inputs. So you've got to watch someone skilled with a screen reader use your app. And then if you observe friction, don't just make it a P4. Take it seriously. If it's just a matter of the screen reader not reaching a certain part of your UI, then that's probably pretty straightforward. But we've seen here that other problems are open-ended, and creative thinking and solutions in those spaces can help everyone. Flutter is so special. For me, it's really been a story of come for the hot reload, stay for the community. But we're still undeniably young. By Russell Keith McGee's count, we still have 14 more years until all of this. Now, I think we're going to get to 1,000-person audiences long before that, because the development community is just cooking a lot hotter than it was 20 years ago. But along the way, all of us contain in our hands the power to define what it means to be a Flutter developer and what it means to use a Flutter app. Thanks so much, everyone.